Hello. This video is meant to give you a basic grounding in body paragraphs for English majors. And before we get started in the real practicalities of body paragraphs for an argumentative paper in an English class, I just want to lay down some of the ground rules. First of all, for any paper in an academic endeavor, the body paragraph is where the basic building blocks of an argument are made. Body paragraphs are the only paragraphs where evidence should be presented. And it is, like I said, the basic building block. What that means is that it is the unit, the singular unit of argument. Any body paragraph should have one claim. It should begin with that claim with a topic sentence. And the role of the rest of that body paragraph is to support that claim. So there should never be more than one claim per body paragraph. And that's really important. If you have more than one claim per body paragraph, you have a disorganized body paragraph, number one, and you very likely have at least one of those claims going unsupported. It also makes it hard for your reader to follow the structure of your argument, because it should be very easy for a reader just by skimming what we call your signposting claims, your thesis, and then your topic sentences. They should have a pretty good idea of the flow of your argument, because those are the places where you tell your reader what the point of each of your paragraphs is. Okay, so lay that out there. A couple of things. Every body paragraph starts with a claim, and it should have direct textual evidence, claims from the text that you are analyzing, and possibly other types of textual support from that text and possibly other texts in that paragraph in support of that same claim. Anything in the body paragraph that is not in direct support of that claim doesn't belong in that body paragraph at all. So you should think of a body paragraph as having not necessarily all organized in this order, but you should have a topic sentence, evidence, and discussion of that evidence. For this reason, typically you shouldn't really expect to ever end a body paragraph with a claim, or excuse me, well, you shouldn't end it with a claim, but you also shouldn't end it with evidence. The reason for this is evidence needs to be discussed. It needs to be analyzed. So you should have a series of claim, always start with the claim, evidence. There may be more than one piece of evidence, but each piece of evidence should be followed by discussion. So you may have basically a structure that looks like claim, evidence, discussion, transition, evidence, discussion, transition, evidence, discussion, conclusion, right? Or you may just have claim, evidence, discussion, but you're going to see that basic type of pattern. That's the sort of basic structure. Be aware, though, that there are some basic ground rules. Start with claim. All evidence must be cited. There must be direct textual evidence in every body paragraph of your paper. And this comes back to some of the discussion in the previous video that's about the sort of academic norms, which is anytime you make a claim, there has to be evidence for it. Otherwise, you're just basically asking your reader to take it on faith. And that's not something that's done in academia, even though it may be something we do in other areas of our life or in other communities that we might belong to. It's just not part of the norms of this particular community. Okay, so now with that little introduction, let's talk about the pragmatics of this paragraph structure, and then I'm going to show you an example of what this might look like out in the wild. So this is going to look a little clunky, but we're going to do it anyway. So let's look at a body paragraph template. Okay, so as already discussed, you want your body paragraph to start with a claim, and we call that claim colloquially, you'll probably have heard this before. We call it a topic sentence. And there are a few kind of criteria for what makes a topic sentence good. One, it should advance your larger argument in the paper, your thesis, right? Every topic sentence should build off of the topic sentence that came before, and it should incrementally build to your greater point, which is your thesis. This is one of those reasons why it should be possible for your reader to be able to skim your topic sentences and have a very good idea, not only of where your paper is going, the structure of the paper, but also the flow of your paper. In terms of the content of your topic sentences, they should not focus on simply plot or textual description, but you should also be drawing connections or discussing concepts central to your argument. So it should be, again, fairly clear, how a plot point that you might mention in an introduction, or a plot pattern that you mention in your introduction, connects to the larger argument that you're making. So you might also draw in or make a reference to a larger concept, right, that has already been brought up in your thesis, or you might say something about its import to a kind of larger institution in the text, or a larger concept or value in the text. You don't want to just give a sort of plot summary in topic sentence. And there are a couple of reasons. One, if you start your body paragraph with a plot summary topic sentence, it's very likely that you will then continue on that pattern. It's very hard to get out of that pattern when you say this happens. It's very natural to then follow up with, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. And in literary criticism, the presumption is that your reader is actually familiar with the text, that they've read it, and that the reason they're reading your paper is that they're interested in a new take on it, or that they're interested in an interpretation they haven't thought about before, that they're interested, in other words, in learning something new about the text. So you want to kind of think of your reader as someone who has read the text before, who's familiar with the larger strokes of the text, that they don't need a plot summary of the text, but maybe there's someone who has read it a few months ago. So you do want to give them specific quotes. You can't expect them to just, remember exactly specific lines or words from the text. Okay, so avoid plot summary topic sentences. And then the other piece of advice I'd give you in terms of topic sentences is, as soon as you've made that topic sentence claim, the claim that the rest of your body paragraph is meant to support, move as quickly as possible to your first piece of evidence. And ideally, this will be a direct quote, but there are different levels of evidence that you might use from a primary or even a secondary text. So just to kind of give you an idea of what might constitute evidence, one might be a kind of very close quote that you use for close reading. So this would be detailed textual evidence. I'm really sorry, my cats are having a fight back there. Okay, so the first thing would be when you have a usually short, but sometimes a little bit more extended direct quote where you're going to kind of pick apart the specifics of the language in a kind of close reading kind of moment. The second type of evidence, textual evidence that you might be using for your piece of evidence here is conceptual and textual. So we might see this as more kind of paraphrasing large plot details, or kind of showing plot patterns as examples. This might include summary of patterns in the text rather than just quotations, but then you're going to want to give you're still going to want to include citations as well. Anytime that you are referring to a specific point in the text, you still want to cite it, as we've discussed before. So if you want to show that kind of pattern, what I generally recommend for that is you might want to give a a direct quote for the first example, and then kind of refer in passing, if you want to show a pattern, to other places in the text. That's a very common kind of pattern. So you give a close reading of the first quote, and then you cite kind of, we can see this pattern happening again at this moment and this moment and this moment, and then cite each of those moments. The third kind of evidence that you might show is what we kind of call conceptual, what we kind of call ideas, right? So this is kind of theoretical or abstract conceptual evidence from a text. So you might want to think about this as when we have a character actually, or sometimes if it's from a novel, we might have the narrator, or, you know, at some point an idea directly being quoted in the text, a kind of claim direct from the mouth of the text itself. So you might think like something like Gloucester saying that we're like, that the gods are like wanton boys and we're the flies whose wings are being torn out. I'm obviously, that's not a direct quote, but those of you who have taken King Lear with me, you know the quote that we're talking about. Okay, that's a concept quote, right? And that's a kind of level of quote that you might take and then kind of use that to kind of frame a discussion of some of the larger philosophical discourse in the text, right? Okay, so those are kind of three different layers of textual evidence that you might take from the quote, from the text, to use as your first quote or other quotes or other types of evidence in your body paragraph. Okay, so you've had your topic sentence. You have introduced and integrated your first piece of evidence. And what I mean by introduce and integrate, what that basically means is that both you found a way to integrate your quote, if it's a direct quote, into a grammatically correct sentence, but also that you've introduced it in such a way that the reader has some context for who said the quote, where in the text it came from. And again, remember, you don't have to give a ton of explanation. You can assume that your reader has some familiarity with the text, but you do want to kind of remind them of when it happened or what the situation was when it was spoken. That's going to make what you're trying to say about the quote make a lot more sense. Okay, so that's what we call introducing the quote. Integrating the quote is the kind of grammatical aspect of making sure that your quote is integrated into your own sentence in a way that is still grammatically correct. Okay, you never just plunk a quote down as its own sentence without any kind of introduction. All right, now again, we use quotes as evidence, but we never let them just kind of sit by themselves. Anytime you have a quote, you want to follow up with discussion and analysis of the quote, and specifically in the context of how it supports your topic sentence, right? So what you're trying to do there is talk about how this evidence, how this textual evidence supports your topic sentence claim, which ultimately is going to help support your thesis, which is your paper. Okay, so there are different ways you can do this. This is usually going to be through close reading, but of course, if you're going to do some of this more structural kind of plot level pattern analysis, then you're going to be kind of analyzing that kind of pattern and kind of showing what that pattern is doing, right? Now, if that's your only piece of evidence, if you're only using one piece of evidence, then that's kind of your paragraph, right? You're going to kind of close it down and kind of wrap it up with kind of explaining how that supported your how that supported your topic sentence. But typically, you're not going to show only one instance of something to try to say that that's, you know, important evidence for your larger paper claim, right? Ideally, you're going to want to look for a pattern, or you're going to want to look for a consistent concern in the text. So ideally, you're going to want to show it, more than one piece of evidence to kind of show that what you're arguing for is something that's showing up consistently, or at least in some kind of marked way in the one instance we see that, the text is really framing this particular concern in a particular way that you are observing and making a case for. Okay, if that's the case, then what you're going to want to do is write a transition, right? That's going to explain the relationship between your first piece of evidence and your second piece of evidence. That may be as similar or as easy as similarly or likewise, but very likely you're going to have to, again, give a little bit more context. There may be a similarity, but with a distinction or a difference, in which case you might say something like, such and such character also sees this problem. However, this character frames it not as X, but Y. Do you know, this is obviously going to depend on the type of argument that you're making. But if there is a distinction between the two pieces of evidence, that can actually be really useful. So I want you to think about those distinctions as actually helping you to clarify your argument rather than as an obstacle to your argument. One of the things that can often harm students is that they try to sort of ignore complicating issues in their arguments, or they see them as evidence they can't use anymore. I'm so sorry. They think of it as evidence they can't use anymore, rather than actually seeing this as, hey, this is the argument that the text is making. It's the logic that the text is building, and it's a complicated logic. And that's perfectly fine. Texts are very rarely linear in the kinds of frameworks that they make. Okay. Again, from that point on, you can add more and more evidence using that same pattern. Evidence can be as short as a few words or as long as, a sentence or two. But in general, you want to think about your body paragraphs, especially for the paper lengths that you're likely to encounter in college. Your body paragraphs should generally be between a half a page and a page in length. Once they're over a page in length, the length of your page has probably exceeded the value of this body paragraph in terms of your overall argument. So you do kind of want to think about, the real estate and how much argumentative force, right? The one thing that might sometimes interfere with that is if you're working with something like a screenplay or a play, and you're having to deal with longer pieces of dialogue, that can sometimes take up a little bit more like literal physical space on the play or on the page, and that can kind of mess with the length of a paragraph in that sense. But you do really want to think about how much space each part of your argument is taking, and is it commensurate with the value of that part of your argument to your larger overall argument in your paper. Okay, I hope that made sense. Okay, last thing I wanted to do is, it's been very abstract how I've been discussing this up until this point. So the last thing I wanted to do is give you an example of what one of these paragraphs might look like in the wild. So here's a paragraph that is focusing on the speech at the beginning of King Lear, Act 1, Scene 2. And this is Edmund explaining his specific feelings about essentially being disinherited because he's illegitimate. And it's a pretty powerful speech. But I just kind of wanted to show the anatomy of this particular paragraph because it's following these rules. So if you look at this first paragraph, you'll see, or excuse me, this first sentence, you'll see that it's a claim. And sorry, my cursor is terrible. Okay, so if we see this first sentence, This sentence is your topic sentence claim. Edmund frames human law as a violation against natural order and strength and sees nature as supporting his attempts to subvert the human laws, which define him as a lesser person ineligible to inherit his father's land. Now that's a mouthful, right? But it is a claim. And you'll notice that it's both referring to a character and a very specific moment in the plot, but it's also invoking larger conceptual issues and conversations happening throughout the play. If you're familiar with King Lear, you know that inheritance is at the heart of the play, but also larger questions of nature's law versus man's law and the kinds of tragedies that happen when a lot of people in power and a lot of people who aren't in power have really fundamental disagreements about how natural law and human law overlap and do not, right? So there are some sort of catastrophic domino effects in this play because of those disagreements. Okay, so Edmund here has this long monologue where he basically invokes nature as a goddess and is railing against the human law that has defined him as a lesser human being. And he basically concludes with saying that he wants the gods to stand up for bastards, and he declares that that he must have his legitimate brother Edgar's inheritance. Okay, so this is sort of the context for those of you who maybe haven't read Lear or haven't read Lear in a while. Okay, so that's your topic sentence. Edmund frames human law as a violation against natural order and strength and sees nature as supporting his attempts to subvert human laws, which define him as a lesser person ineligible to inherit his father's land. Okay, so we would call this the topic sentence. From here, from this moment while, really to this section, this last bit here, which I would say is the conclusion, right? This all, I would say, is the evidence and discussion, right? Evidence and analysis section, okay? So here we have an introduction and integration of a couple of quotes in this next sentence. While his father or King Lear, so his father is Gloucester, while his father or King Lear might expect nature to support human hierarchies and laws, Edmund sees nature as giving the most strength where people refuse to be bound by the, quote, plague of custom. So that's a piece of textual support, right? Or the curiosity of nations. So both of these are quotes from consecutive lines, as you can see here from the citation. And you notice here that even though they're consecutive lines, since the quotes themselves are not running together, you actually have to give two separate citations here. Okay, by diminishing human law to simple curiosity, right? And it's referring back to the curiosity mentioned in the previous sentence, and calling it a plague, again, referring to the previous sentence. This is what we call close reading, right? Edmund demonstrates his own contempt and hatred for the human laws and rules which he feels have cheated and deprived him of his birthright. So here, again, this is continuing the analysis of the quotes that have been presented in the previous sentence. And that this is going to continue in the next sentence, but that next sentence is going to introduce more evidence. To him, these laws make people lesser. The people born through marriage are less strong, less vibrant, less alive than he is. And thus, it is only natural that he should win over his, quote, fop of a brother, born in a lawful but, quote, dull, stale, tired marriage bed. Okay, so this is introducing more of the argument, and through that, more quotes from the same speech. And then it's going to get developed a little bit the discussion of this is going to get developed a little bit more in the analysis in the next sentence. The law, he suggests, is not only unnatural, but enfeebling. It makes people less than what they can be, and he argues that it is unjust that such foolish and destructive rules stand between him and his inheritance. Okay, he expects not only nature, but other gods to stand up for bastards, the end of his speech, because he sees human law as operating in contradiction to natural order. So you notice here, it's still integrating evidence, but in order to come to the conclusion, and that conclusion matches the introductory statement in the topic sentence. So Edmund frames human law as a violation against natural order and strength. And at the end, he sees human law as operating in contradiction to natural order. It's the same claim, right? But by this point, it's built in quite a lot of evidence to support that claim. This whole paragraph, though it seems to go in all kinds of directions, is actually all supporting that one point with, at this point, quite a bit of evidence. Now, one thing I want to note here is that in this case, all of that evidence is quite localized, right? Those are very short quotes. And that is most effective if you're going to use that kind of effect. That tends to be most effective if you have a very localized argument, right? All of this argument is based in a very specific moment in the text, right? I wouldn't find this as productive a technique if you had a paragraph that was jumping, let's say, from a quote in Act 2 to a quote in Act 3 and then back to a quote in Act 1. Little 2 or 3 word quotes would maybe not be quite as effective, right, as an argument that's being built up from one speech, right? I would definitely argue that if you wanted to do something that was talking about a pattern across a text, you would probably use more structural description of some moments from the plot, but you would then want to start and maybe end with a couple of those examples being directly quoted, maybe at the beginning of the body paragraph and at the end of the body paragraph, with your most effective examples directly quoted. That might be the most effective way to use your textual support in that case. Okay, so that's body paragraphs and how they work in an English paper. The other thing that I would just want to mention is how they work in the larger context of the structure of the paper. I've already somewhat alluded to this, but I just want to reiterate it one more time. Each body paragraph should have a different claim than the body paragraph that came before. And they should build to your thesis. So you want to avoid the type of what we call a 5 paragraph body structure, which actually isn't about how many paragraphs you have, but it has to do with the argumentative structure. And the best way that I can use to describe a 5 paragraph body structure is that you have an introductory paragraph that introduces a thesis, and then you have a series of anywhere from 3 to however many body paragraphs that all have the same claim, but a different example of the same claim. So a 5 paragraph essay, you could literally shuffle the order of all of your body paragraphs, and as long as you didn't have first, second, third in the topic sentence, it wouldn't matter what order the body paragraphs are in, because they're all making the same point. It's just different examples of the same point. And that's kind of acceptable in high school, but in college classes, and especially in upper level college classes, you really should be moving on there from that model, because what that model of writing does is it really limits the complexity of the argument you can make, right? You can only kind of make a single layer argument with that type of structure. Instead, what you really want to focus on is making an argument that that builds, in which the claim that you made in your last body paragraph becomes the kind of foundation that lets you leap off into your next body paragraph claim. So you might have, let's say, I'm making this up on the fly, but you have like King Lear, and you might say, King Lear opens by making very clear through the characters of Edmund and Lear's daughters that even in the upper levels of the court, the laws kind of empower some people and completely disempower other people through inheritance structures. The next, and then you'd have to explain that through evidence. Your next topic sentence might be, in this, despite these laws, those in power equate love with inheritance, right? Because this happens, or love with property. Okay, your next body paragraph might be something, even though parents often claim this, their behaviors conflict with their stated equation of love and property, and then you can kind of go from there. I'm hoping what's clear from that sequence is that each claim builds off of the idea in the previous claim. So you have an argument that progresses and gets more complicated and more involved with each body paragraph. You couldn't make the next body paragraph, or the next body paragraph wouldn't feel as complex or as contextualized without the body paragraph that preceded it. Okay, so you want an argument that is structured almost like a staircase, where your first topic sentence is the first step on the staircase, and then it builds, and the top step, your last topic sentence, is probably going to look a lot like your thesis, because it's the destination, it's the last part of your argument that you arrive at. Okay, so that's the last thing that I kind of wanted to mention as pertinent to body paragraphs. At that point, there's nothing left to do but your conclusion. And your conclusion shouldn't introduce any new evidence, because introducing evidence and making your claims and your arguments, that's the job or the role of the body paragraphs in your paper, right? So there should be no quotes in your introduction, ideally, and no quotes in your conclusion. All right, because that's evidence, and evidence is for argumentation. Okay, that's it for now. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next of these. Take care.